Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions 2022, a masterclass brought to you by the Foreign Policy Association. For more than a century, the FPA has sought to promote a public dialogue in world affairs and U.S. foreign policy. Toward that aim, it offers its annual Great Decisions program. The editors at the FPA select 8 challenges, or great decisions, confronting the American public and our foreign policy makers. Many chapters on each of the 8 topics is bound in the Great Decisions Handbook. For information on all Great Decisions material, please visit fpa.org. The topics for 2022 are changing demographics, outer space, climate change, Russia and the United States, Myanmar and ASEAN, the Quad Alliance, drug policy towards Latin America and the Caribbean, and industrial policy. In 2022, we're offering a bonus lecture, The Biden Foreign Policy Agenda. Without further ado, let's look at our first great decision of 2022, changing demographics. To do so, we'll look at 3 main considerations. The first is the sheer numbers, how many people on the planet. Next is the location of those populations, and finally is the movement of people or human migration. Once we've done so, we'll be ready to consider foreign policy options. First, however, let's talk a little bit about the importance of demographics for a nation, past, present, and future. If you were to ask me to predict the future of a nation, Turkey in 10 years, China at mid-century, Russia at the year 2100, I would collect 3 bits of information for that analysis. First, I'd look at the geography of the country. How rich is the soil? What are the natural resources? Do the rivers connect major population centers? Do the mountains protect from without dividing within? Next, I'd look at the geostrategic location. That's where the country is relative to other major powers at the regional and international level. And then finally, I look at the demographics, the population, and the population trend line. Based upon these 3 considerations, we can get a pretty clear idea of where countries will be moving forward. If we look at the population tree for the world, it's a pretty healthy pyramid. It isn't overly top-heavy. It's not narrowing at the base. Looking simply at this trend line, we can project that between now and mid-century, the Earth will increase its population by roughly 25%. Compare that to Japan, which has a miserable population tree, top-heavy, and then every group below the age of 44 is smaller than the one that preceded it. Japan's population is disappearing before our eyes, and it will have to make some very hard decisions about immigration in particular. Italy is no better off. This is something we see happening in many advanced Western societies. As people become wealthier, they don't have the need for large numbers of children. They have savings accounts, retirement portfolios. They don't have to worry about 2 or 3 grown sons taking care of them in their own age. Young ladies stay in college longer, they start their own businesses, and as a result in the Western world, what we're seeing happening in Japan and Italy is in many ways the future of France, Spain, Denmark, and many others. This is the reason that there are millions of homes that are unoccupied in Japan and Italy. You may have seen the advertisements, a home in Italy for €1, one in Japan for 100 yen. They're doing everything they can to bring people into the country because of their demographic crisis in the not too distant future. Russia suffers from a similar demographic challenge. You can see the winnowing out at the base. Russia's population is in clear decline and in need of reversal. This helps us understand why Russia puts so much pressure on Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, talking at times about re-adding them to the Russian Federation, reversing the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Part of that calculation is demographic. And if we go to somewhere like Syria, we see the exact opposite. This is the fastest growing population in the world in a country that struggles mightily to take care of its current population. The United States has a very healthy population pyramid. There is some winnowing at the base. However, immigration has gone a long way to preventing the U.S. from suffering the same fate as Japan and Italy. We presently have 331 million people in the country. By 2050, the consensus projection is 379. We're not growing too quickly. We're not shrinking in size. This is a very healthy trend line for the United States and one reason to be bullish on U.S. futures moving forward. Immigration policies, today's great decision, will go a very long way in determining whether the American population continues to grow moving forward. Here we can see several different projections of U.S. demographic change over time, between now and 2060. If we were to cut off immigration completely, our population would be smaller in 40 years than it is today. Low immigration, main immigration, and high immigration estimates are all provided. So the U.S. has many tools at its disposal to address its demographic challenge. The most obvious is that of immigration. Let's now look at the numbers. Population has grown worldwide significantly since 1900. When my grandmother was born at the turn of the century, there were 1.6 billion people on the planet. By mid-century, despite 2 devastating world wars and a global pandemic, the Spanish flu of 1917, the population was up to 2.6 billion. By the year 2000, we hit 6 billion, and today we are at 8 billion. Projections moving forward, as noted earlier, are for a 25% increase to roughly 10 billion people by 2050. When I first started studying world politics in the early 1980s, the consensus projection was 12 billion and the upper level was closer to 20 billion. I don't think we ever hit the 10 billion mark, given the rapid aging that is happening in most of the world. Next is the location of the population. As we look at a world map, we note that 60% of all of the people alive today are on the continent of Asia. Africa has 17%. Europe, which for centuries was the political, economic, and military center of the world, slightly below 10%. And here in the Americas, North, South, Central, and the Caribbean, roughly 12% of the world's population resides in our hemisphere. Populations are increasing in Asia and Latin America, but not terribly quickly. Compare that with Africa, which has the highest rate of population growth, 2.5% annually. Now, to put that into basic terms, that means in 30 years, Africa's population is going to double in size. Where all of those people are going to live, how they'll find the resources to provide for them, and of course the human migration likely to result from that rapid growth in population in Africa is relatively certain. Now, the people don't simply live in continents and in countries, they also live in countrysides and in cities. If we look at the planet's population roughly 100 years ago, it was overwhelmingly rural. A small portion of society lived in the cities. But over the course of the 1900s, things have leveled out. In fact, in 2007, for the very first time, there was a balance. Half of the world's population in rural areas and half in the urban or city areas. By 2050, the expectation is that roughly 70% of all humans will live in urban centers. This puts enormous pressure on governments to provide services. So what does that mean if everyone's moving towards the cities? First of all, it's a very real threat to biodiversity, because as these cities build out, get larger, as suburban areas and beyond develop, that can threaten the biodiversity balance. Next, we experience a very real water challenge, because cities are largely concrete. Lakes and rivers are diverted, they're changed to accommodate the people. Very rarely do urban centers collect enough rainfall for the growing population. And that means we have real challenges in delivering water to those people. Third, the challenge of air pollution. It's the industry, the automobiles, the homes, all of it creating pollution. Because people are increasingly concentrated in cities, it's much easier for diseases, the annual influenza or the once-in-a-century pandemic, to spread very, very quickly. Emissions from automobiles and industries, CO2 and methane into the air, is a real problem related to urbanization. And then finally, the reality of slums, where people are pushed to the periphery and beyond of the cities because they can no longer afford to live there. They may well work in the cities, but they need transportation to get them into the place where their jobs are located. Here at the Foreign Policy Association, we try our best to be balanced. Here are 6 very real problems associated with urbanization. On the other side of the coin, however, is the reality that urbanization is part of industrial society, modern world politics, and because of the global trading system, prosperity has exploded over the course of the last century, and especially since World War II. This is a very positive part of urbanization, which allows for economies of scale. Next, we look at human migration, the movement of people. Since 1500, the onset of modern world politics, people have moved largely from Europe to the Americas and from Africa to the Western Hemisphere. The Europeans moved by volition. The Africans were brought as part of the slave trade, and from South Asia, people moved all over the globe. Today, we see human migration largely moving from south to north, from underdeveloped countries to developed countries, and then on to the highly developed economic elite countries of Western Europe, North America, and Oceania. This graph provided by the World Economic Forum shows us where people are moving to. The tan areas like Australia, Western Europe, and North America, that's the traditional destination of migrants. Then if you look at the darker areas, portions of South Africa, Eastern Europe, those are the new destinations, in addition to the traditional, of course, of immigration. And then the brownish areas in the middle, those are the highest volume of migration sources. People are moving from rural China to the coastline for the excitement, for the jobs, for the opportunity. The frontline states in Southern Africa are moving to South Africa, which is much more economically developed, and many from the Middle East are escaping the wars and the repression on their way to Europe, East, Central, and West. We divide migration into broad categories, voluntary and involuntary. You move voluntarily to find a better job, involuntarily to find any job at all. Voluntarily, you move to join your family in another country. Involuntary is when you bring your family with you for fear of persecution or danger. Voluntary migration is to enjoy the better freedoms in Western Europe or North America, while the involuntary is largely driven to avoid persecution for political beliefs, for skin color, ethnicity, language, or religion. Two very different categories of migration. If it is voluntary, the rules are basically embedded in domestic law. Involuntary migration, refugees, asylum seekers, that's dictated by both domestic and international law. Let's look at the involuntary side first. There is an international law for refugees. When an individual crosses an international boundary out of a well-founded fear of harm, upon arrival, they're designated as a refugee and they are allowed the right to claim asylum. They are claiming the right to ask for asylum. Asylum is a wholly domestic determination, and very oftentimes it involves a very complicated legal process. In each country, the asylum laws vary, and how judges interpret a well-founded fear of harm varies greatly from one judicial system to another. Migration into the United States has increased and done so sharply in the post-World War II era, especially since the Cold War ended and we became truly global as an economic system. As you can see in 2020, in the neighborhood of 43 million people migrated into the United States. That's a very healthy portion of our overall population of 330 million. Where do they go? Not surprisingly, the major ports of call on the West Coast, in Texas, South Florida, and the Eastern Seaboard. Migration hit Europe in 2016 like never before. 1 million people migrated from the Middle East and North Africa because of the armed conflicts happening there, climate change that had devastated their jobs, and the advent of robotics and artificial intelligence, which was taking their place in the workforce. The Europeans were wholly incapable of working as a group in responding to these migration waves. Hungary, Germany treated migrants in completely different fashion, even though both are members of the European Union and both are bound by the same international laws. We can now consider American foreign policy options. We'll do so by looking at them in these two categories, preemptive versus reactive. Do we deal with migrants when they arrive in the United States? That would be reactive. Or do we attempt to address the underlying causes that brought those people to our border in the first place? Let's begin with the reactive. Here we have two countries, one green, one yellow, separated by an international boundary. People from that country are moving to the right. And when they do so, they confront a barrier. It could be a physical wall, it could be a legal boundary. There will obviously be ports of entry because neighboring countries almost always trade with one another. So as these people enter through the legal port, they're going to go through a processing center. They'll enter one side, they'll exit from the other, and they'll be confronted by a court system with judges that apply the laws of the country and the international binding rules. Some of those will make it through the court system and be released to the host country, be asked to return later for further processing. Others will be deported back to their country of origin. Still others will enter the country illegally. Those will confront law enforcement. And they may end up in a set of cages, like we see from the Obama administration, or very similar cages from the Trump administration. Or possibly they'll confront law enforcement on horseback, whipping them back into Mexico in the Biden administration. This is one of the great challenges we confront these days when unaccompanied migrant children arrive on the border. You can't very easily process them without knowing who they are or even what country they came from, and it's certainly very difficult to detain them for long or send them back to their country of origin without a parent to look after them. How about the underlying causes of migration? Maybe that's a better place to construct foreign policy. The problem here is that the challenges abroad are incredibly great, and our leverage may not be outstanding. Conflicts abroad, repression by governments that are dictatorial, job dislocation for a variety of reasons, including climate change, that can make a place inhospitable. Or maybe it's simply the economic and lifestyle inequalities in the world. Even in the poorest countries, they have access to Wi-Fi. They see the lives that we lead, the safety of our streets, the opportunity to work and earn a respectful living. That draws people into the United States. There is a simple reality about migration that is unavoidable. It's a reality in world politics. People have been migrating for as long as people have existed, and there's no reason to believe they're going to stop anytime soon. Most of the migration is happening from south, underdeveloped and struggling economies, to the north, developed political, social, and economic orders. Our border will never be airtight. If we wanted it to be, we probably could not accomplish that, even by building the tallest and widest of walls or hiring large numbers of migration officials. And finally, and very importantly, migration between countries historically is directly linked to trade. If we trade with a country, we migrate there and they migrate here. The higher the volume of trade, the higher the volume of migration, as indicated here. Presidential policies. Let's compare two of them, Donald Trump and Joseph Biden. Mr. Trump was highly critical of free trade agreements and very restrictive on immigration. This is logically consistent, understanding that trade is linked to migration. We don't know if it was Mr. Trump's concern over migration that led him to be critical of free trade agreements, or they simply lined up in his agenda. Mr. Biden, on the other hand, largely supports free trade agreements and is much more lenient on immigration. That seems to indicate a conservative, liberal, Republican, Democrat divide on issues like free trade and migration. But that would be a mistake. If we go back to the 1980s, President Reagan was a champion of free trade and among the most lenient American presidents on immigration with his amnesty proposal. So it's not so simple as to look at party ID or even philosophical location on the spectrum. Each president will have his or her own view of free trade and immigration. They should line up, as these do, but it's not unusual to see politicians mix and match their policies. This concludes the first of 9 lectures in this master class. Thank you for attending, stay engaged, and make great decisions. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions 2022, a 9-lecture masterclass brought to you by the Foreign Policy Association. Topic number 1, changing demographics, gives way to a very different challenge here with topic number 2, outer space. For as long as humans have existed, we've looked to the skies with great wonder and curiosity, marveling at the planets, the stars, the systems above us, always trying to make sense of it, looking for order, and looking for patterns. Some civilizations believed that the gods resided in the heavens, and they simply left it at that. But as knowledge began to expand, we began to theorize about our place within the system. It was quite popular to believe that the Earth was the center of the system, with all things, including the planets and the stars, revolving around the Earth. Ptolemy, part of the Renaissance of the 16th century, challenged that. A mathematician, an astronomer, he introduced the idea that perhaps the sun is at the center of our solar system. Interestingly, 18 centuries earlier, a Greek mathematician and astronomer reached the very same conclusion. Now we understand that all life began in outer space with the Big Bang. We begin with a thumbnail sketch of outer space. It is, simply put, the area beyond the Earth. We do not have a consensus over the line that separates airspace from outer space. The most common dividing line is called the Kármán line, which is 62 miles above sea level. We do not know the overall size of outer space, but what we do know is that there is no friction there. Three main considerations for this foreign policy challenge: the space race, regulating outer space, and private space travel. Once we've completed those, we'll be ready to consider American foreign policy options. Let's start with the space race. 1957 was a shock to the world. Sputnik, a Russian satellite orbiting the Earth. We never saw this coming. It immediately put outer space as part of the superpower competition. Everything changed in 1957. The space race was on. The United States created NASA with the sole purpose of exploring outer space and eventually reaching the moon. But in 1961, the Soviets beat us again. A cosmonaut from Russia became the very first human to enter outer space and to return to Earth safely. NASA, of course, continued its pledge to beat the Russians to the moon. John F. Kennedy was there to challenge America as well, to say that we can beat the Russians to the moon, we can win the space race. And we did win that space race. In 1969, an American lands and walks on the moon. Here we have that iconic photo. NASA continued its exploration of outer space with many successes and sadly far too many failures. Here you see the Challenger as it exploded shortly after takeoff. The International Space Station's establishment in the late 1990s was a major step forward, both in scientific progress but also in international cooperation, because both the Russians and the Americans utilized the space station along with a large number of other international scientists. And more recently, we have made it to Mars with the rover, collecting samples so that we can learn more about the red planet. So what's next in this space race? Expeditions to other planets? Settlements on the moon? Maybe interstellar space missions? Or perhaps outer space becoming a militarized battleground? We now consider the regulation of outer space. Prior to the First World War, there were several theories on a nation-state's relationship to the air above it. On one end of the spectrum was that collection of countries that argued, using the old Latin phrase usque ad coelum, that a nation's sovereignty extends into the heavens. There are no limits. The country enjoys ownership over everything above it. On the other end of the spectrum, some countries argued for res communis, or common heritage, meaning that airspace is open to all. It can be explored by any, and no nation state can claim sovereignty over it. The point in between would be a line separating airspace from outer space, with the nation state enjoying sovereignty up until that point. And then above, it would be res communis. The experience in World War I greatly influenced the global consensus on airspace law. The Germans in particular were able to use their air balloons. They did so for purposes of espionage, for the movement of troops, and for the dropping of bombs. And it's also in World War I that we saw military aircraft play a very important role in the outcome of battles. As a result of that experience, shortly thereafter at the Paris Convention, it was determined that each nation state owns the airspace above it. Usque ad coelum became the reigning principle to regulate airspace and outer space. Sovereignty extending into the heavens, permission must be requested and provided